Anyway, so you wanted to fight about next week on the card will be Gregor Gillespie versus Brad Whittle. Now, why did you want to bring this up?
Well, Gregor Gillespie has actually had a huge amount of time off. His last fight was a loss against Kevin Lee. You remember that? I believe it was in the first round, head kick KO.
Oh,
brutal.
Yes.
He was straight out, knocked out, unconscious, hit the cage with the back of his head, slid down, had to be called off. It was a nasty KO to watch. Gregor Gillespie is always known for being effective with the wrestling, but his striking as well. And his aerobic conditioning is very high level. You're always watching him doing conditioning workouts, and he's a unique fighter, to be honest. I'd love to see him. I want to see him very soon. However, I'll have to wait until next week. Brad Riddell, coming out of City Kickboxing, fellow teammate of Israel Adesanya, Kai Kara-France, Carlos Ulberg, and things like that. Mm-hmm. Interesting fight for Brad because although he is a great fighter, he's not yet ranked yet, and he's looking to enter the top 5 by fighting Gregor Gillespie now at number 15. Gillespie was a little bit higher earlier, however, he's dropped a little bit due to a little bit inactivity. He lost to Kevin Lee.
But that's his only loss.
That is his only loss. Gregor Gillespie had a huge amount of hype around him. He was undefeated before fighting Kevin Lee. However, Kevin Lee used a very low stance in that fight. Looked like he was going to, with that stance, mask his takedowns. But he then, perhaps made Gregor Gillespie kind of think quite a fair bit about the takedowns a little bit too much. Went up high with the head kick, hit him flush on the chin, and it almost looked like he hit Gillespie up in the air. It was that perfect timed shot with incredibly powerful legs. So he knocked out Gregor Gillespie it was pretty brutal to watch. Pretty brutal finish. It will be interesting to see how he fights Brad Riddell. Since Gregor Gillespie, he's had a bit of time off. He's had a huge amount of time. Can you remind me, was it 2019 that he lost to
2019 November 2nd. So he's had well over a year and about 4 months off now since his last fight.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, we've talked about this in the past, but when fighters take a loss and they take some time off, they sort of really put on so much skill.
A huge amount of growth, especially for Gillespie, since it'll be 2 years. Well, let's say maybe just over a year to be honest. But that's a long hiatus for a fighter after a pretty brutal knockout like that. Brad Riddell, 6-fight win streak at the moment, hasn't broke the top 15, hoping to make a name for himself against Gregor Gillespie. An interesting matchup. Now, I don't believe that Israel Adesanya's coach, Eugene Barryman, will actually be able to be in Brad Riddell's corner. He won't be able to, because UFC 259 came about so quickly, he flew out for Israel Adesanya. Obviously, he flew out for Kai and for Carlos as well. However, by flying back to New Zealand, doing the quarantine, he won't have the time to do the quarantine, come back, and then be able to corner Brad Riddell. So interesting how that goes with who will be in Riddell's corner. I'm not certain. Riddell coming from City Kickboxing and from Tiger Muay Thai, very good on the feet. Gillespie, very good on the feet as well. It'd be interesting how any grappling takes place, to be honest. Riddell, purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So obviously proficient on the ground if he does get taken on his back or takes down Gillespie. I don't know who I take in this fight, to be honest. The only factor for me right now is Gillespie has fought those in the top 15, whereas Brad Riddell has not. So it's an interesting challenge for Riddell, but Gillespie's came off a pretty brutal KO, right? I do question, how does that affect your performance in your following fight when you haven't been active? Does that that's got to be Kevin Lee's best KO.
Yeah, it was. It was the one that, even the commentators were losing their minds over it. Well, one thing we got to put on the bat, one thing we can sort of credit to is Gregor Gillespie. A lot of his wins have either come by submission. He's got quite a few knockouts through punches. But one thing that's important for him is that he's always had a very, very aggressive, controlling style, fighting style. It was because he comes from a really strong wrestling background. He was an NCAA division champion, national champion, 149 pounds, and a 4-time NCAA champion, All-American, and 3-time EPL and PSA conference champion. So he's pretty much competing a lot of types of wrestling. And in the years that he's been active as a fighter, MMA fighter, has been from 2012. So he's been fighting for just under a decade. To take some time off, he allows him to really sort of develop his striking. But it was just his defensive striking, because one of the criticisms I believe I was just reading about that people have of him is that he's so used to going on offense in terms of and defending himself in terms of grappling, but he's not that used to defensive striking. He's not used to checking kicks. He's not used to blocking kicks. Offensive
striking is quite good.
Yeah.
He does have knockouts in his record. However, his grappling, due to his wrestling background, was the main thing. That could have played an issue. Now he fought Kevin Lee. Kevin Lee, coming from a wrestling background as well, able to neutralize a little bit of any sort of grappling that was going to occur. I believe also just because who he was fighting against, Kevin Lee, probably made him think, oh, he might take me down, right? He might not be wanting to trade with me. He might take me down just because of his previous loss beforehand.
Here's how good his wrestling background is. He has beaten Michael.
He has gold medals in fucking everything.
Yeah, he's beaten Michael Chandler in wrestling.
Yes,
but he's lost to Jordan Burroughs. But Jordan Burroughs is like the American. He's the American gold medalist. So, but there's some names on here that I'm looking at that are quite popular within the grappling world. So, even if one thing that's I love to see is when you see champions come over from other disciplines, and then they perform really, really well, and they play to their strengths in MMA. That just shows how the transition just works for them.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Who would you say that you would take in this? Because Brad, obviously coming off a 6-fight win streak, coming from City Kickboxing, although he won't have his head coach there, he's incredible on stand-up, right? Coming from City Kickboxing and Tiger Muay Thai. However, he's got a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Obviously proficient if he ends up on his back or when he is on top. However, Gregor Gillespie, blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, very, very good wrestling base and does have that offensive power. However, we know that when he's put on the back foot, not as dynamic with getting out of the way of any strikes, as well as checking kicks and checking and catching punches. So who would you say that you would take in this matchup?
It's a hard one for me because I don't know that much about Brad Riddle. I want to say Gregor. Because just, he's taken so much time out of the sport, and Brad's last fight was on Adesanya versus Costa card, so he's
UFC 253.
Yeah, and he had a good 2020, a couple wins. He hasn't lost since 2018. So, yeah, I'm gonna have to go, Gregor.
Right.
Yeah.
Another